And now to introduce our 2 o'clock Interfaith Lecture Series here in the Hall of Philosophy, where this week we're presenting the theme, Crisis of Faith. Our distinguished guests today are Bill Moyers and Robert Jones. He prefers to be known as Robbie P. Jones. Now, Bill has urged me not to provide an introduction. We all know and love the work of Bill Moyers and Judith Moyers, and so we thank you, Bill, for being with us. I take a special point of pride in Robbie Jones as he earned his PhD from Emory University in the Graduate Division of Religion, and those of us who are on the faculty there regard him as the most famous and best-selling author that we have produced. So there's both a mixture of great admiration and enormous envy among the faculty. You'll be pleased to know that Robbie Jones will be doing a book signing on the porch of the Hall of Missions immediately after this presentation, and that his books will be sold there as well. The title of Robbie Jones' presentation is What the End of White Christian America Means for Our Shared Sense of National Identity. We're very grateful today to the Eileen and Warren Martin Lectureship for Emerging Studies in Bible and Theology for providing support for this week's Interfaith Lecture Series. Hannah and members of the Martin family are here. I ask you to stand as we thank you for your support and your family's longstanding support. Thank you. Finally, please be reminded that at 3:30 today, we hope you will remain right here in the Hall of Philosophy to hear Alan Cooperman, who is Director of Religion Research at the Pew Research Center. So today is a rich, data-rich, and full beginning to our week's conversation. We're delighted that Bill and Robbie Jones are here, and I'll ask you to join me in providing them with a warm Chautauqua welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you're around when the rapture occurs, because I will need an introduction to the archangels. All right? Those of us on television do need introductions. I'm accustomed to people coming up to me on the street and saying, "I know you. Who are you?" Judith and I were once walking down 77th Street in New York, and a couple of women were coming toward us, and you can see that instant glint of recognition in their eyes. And as they got close, one of the ladies said, "I know you. Who are you?" And Judith said, "Ma'am, we've been living together 50 years, and he still doesn't know." So introductions do help. It's so good to be back and see the faces of so many kindred spirits. I can't see those of you out beyond the columns, except I can see you in my mind's eye. And I can see when you're naughty or nice. I can see if you're dozing. And I keep my eye on the sparrow in the tree above you and on you, and I'm grateful for your presence too. Our text for the week comes from the 3rd chapter of Genesis, the 25th verse. Adam and Eve are on their way out of the garden. They're being evicted. For a long time, they've had the run of the world's most exclusive location, sort of the Club Med of the Euphrates. It's lush with fruit trees. Their favorite is the apple tree. One bite works wonders. And their next favorite is the fig leaf, whose leaves they use to protect their most prized assets. For beauty, there are flowers of all varieties, but no cactus. And for company, there's a charming snake in the neighborhood who has volunteered to be their life coach. They have a perpetual lease, all the conveniences, and a trust fund from Adam's old man that is inexhaustible. But something's gone wrong. They've offended the old guy, and he's shown them the door. Out you go, get away, be gone, away with you. And as they leave, Adam utters those memorable words that have come down through the ages. My dear, we live in an age of transition. I'm just kidding, of course. There is no 25th verse of the 3rd chapter of Genesis. As a Baptist with the freedom to interpret the scripture my own way, I made that up to make a point. And the point is, from the very beginning, we humans have been living in ages of transition. And we're certainly in one now. Our theme for the week is posed as a question. As our friends at the Department of Religion put it in the invitations they sent to all of us who are participating, quote, major research organizations report that religions are undergoing dramatic change, a decline in mainstream Christianity and practicing Judaism, demographic shifts toward a growing Muslim population, and more young people than ever who claim no affiliation with any organized possibilities. And here's the question they ask us to address. Do all these trends add up to a crisis of faith? A crisis individually and personally? A collective crisis for any or all religion? And a crisis for democracy. Our lecturers every morning at 10:45 will address facets of the question. We heard a brilliant one at 10:45 this morning from Andrew Sullivan. Every afternoon I will introduce and have a conversation with someone with particular expertise, after which we'll open the floor to questions from you. And on Friday afternoon, I will attempt to round out what we have heard with some personal and journalistic commentary, followed by a conversation at 3:30 led by Robert Franklin on the week that was, with questions from you. We begin this afternoon with the numbers. Last year, before the election, a book appeared that immediately became the talk of the political class. I read it very early, even before it had actually reached the shelves or Amazon's pipeline, because its title was The End of White Christian America. And I thought, the author's talking about me. I'm going to be extinct. It's author Robert P. Jones, whom, as Reverend Franklin said, prefers with his friends and audiences to be known as Robbie. He's a longtime student of religion in America. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics and Computing Science, a Master of Divinity, and a PhD in Religion from Emory University. He's co-chair of the National Steering Committee for Religion and Politics at the American Academy of Religion. And he's on the editorial board, among others, of the journal Politics and Religion, published in Cambridge. You can read his column at The Atlantic online. You can hear him regularly on Interfaith Voices, the nation's leading religion magazine on public radio, and you can see him on CNN and other national media outlets. He's founder of the Public Religion Research Institute, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and education organization that conducts public opinion polls that we journalists relish to read, along with scholars, policymakers, and interested citizens like you. We welcome you, Robbie. You'll have the floor for the first 15 to 20 minutes, at which time I will turn the red light on the camera back there. I'll blow the whistle, and then we'll take questions from the audience. But first, I just want you to say hello to a wonderful audience that it is my pleasure to be among for the second year in a row. Robbie Jones.
All right. Thank you for coming today. Mike? Hello. Testing, testing, testing. Am I on? All right, I'll use this one then. There we go. All right. After a long life spanning nearly 240 years, white Christian America, a prominent cultural force in the nation's history, has died. White Christian America first began to exhibit troubling symptoms in the 1960s when white mainline Protestants denominations began to shrink. But it showed signs of rallying with the rise of the Christian right in the 1980s. Following the 2004 presidential election, however, it became clear that white Christian America's powers were failing. Although examiners have not been able to pinpoint the exact time of death, the best evidence suggests that white Christian America finally succumbed in the latter part of the first decade of the 21st century. The cause of death was determined to be a combination of environmental and internal factors, complications stemming from major demographic changes in the country, along with religious disaffiliation of many of its younger members as they begin to doubt white Christian America's continued relevance in the shifting cultural environment. Among white Christian America's notable achievements was its service to the nation as a cultural touchstone during most of its life. It provided a shared aesthetic, a historical framework, and a moral vocabulary. White Christian America's vibrancy was historically one of the most prominent features of American public life. While the common cultural ground it offered did not prevent vehement or even bloody conflicts from erupting, the lingua franca of white Christian America gave them a coherent frame. During its long life, white Christian America also produced a dizzying array of institutions, from churches to hospitals, social service organizations, and civic organizations such as this one, and the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, the YMCA. But beyond these direct functions, white Christian America also helped incubate and promote the missions of countless independent non-governmental organizations that met in its facilities, staffed by its members. Widespread participation in white Christian America's lay leadership positions served as an important source of social capital for the nation, instilling in participants skills they carried not only to other civic organizations, but to democratic governance itself. But white Christian America has not been without its critics and controversies. Its reputation was especially marred by its general accommodation to and participation in the institution of slavery up until the Civil War. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, white Christian America's apathy toward, and in some quarters even staunch defense of, segregation in the American South did little to overturn these negative associations. Its credibility was also damaged when it became mired in partisan politics in the closing decades of the 20th century. Late in its life, white Christian America also struggled to adequately address issues such as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender rights, which were of particular importance to its younger members as well as to younger Americans overall. White Christian America is survived by two principal branches of descendants: a mainline Protestant family presiding primarily in the Northeast and Upper Midwest, and an evangelical Protestant family living mostly in the South. Plans for a public memorial service have not been announced. So that's from the beginning of my book, An Obituary for White Christian America. So my family goes back 6 generations in the red clay of South Georgia, which is where both sides of my family are from. It's a tradition among my people there that when there's a funeral, you lay out the body, right? There's a visitation period where the body is typically open casket, and people come in and they visit the family, and they even will touch the body and hold its hand or touch the face of the deceased. And part of that is about, as I was a little kid saying, like, what is this weird thing about the first time I saw this? People were saying it's about closure. It's about saying goodbye. And that sometimes it's hard to say goodbye to someone if you haven't seen their dead body. At least one way of thinking about the talk I'm giving today is that I'm trying to lay out the body of white Christian America to help us say goodbye. Now, I want to be clear about what I'm talking about here. For what I do mean is really, I'm using this as white Christian America as a metaphor. And it's really a metaphor for the cultural and political edifice that was built primarily by white Protestant Christians that really did set the tone for our national conversations and shaped American ideals. So what I'm not talking about, let me be clear about that, I'm not talking about the end of all white Christian churches. There's enough people here, right, to clearly refute that thesis, nor am I talking about the end of all white Christians. Again, I could take one bench here and, refute that thesis handily. But what I am talking about is the end of the era of their cultural and demographic dominance. So let me lay this out a little bit with numbers. I'm going to try to avoid using the word statistics, just even though I love those things. Most people don't. So think of these as vital signs that I'm giving you here, that really marking the end of white Christian America's life. So if we're looking at the chart, right, that was hanging on the hospital bed, here's what you would see toward the end of white Christian America's life. The most, I think, dominant one, the one that really led me to write the book, was this realization that we had passed a very significant milestone in this country that virtually no one was talking about, and that is that we had gone from being a majority white Christian country to a country that is no longer a majority white Christian country, and that happened just in the last decade. So this is a very recent event, but it's been a very precipitous fall here. So if we go back just 2 election cycles ago to 2008, when Barack Obama was running for president, 54% of the country identified as white and Christian. By that I mean white, non-Hispanic, and any kind of Christian. So if you put Catholics, Protestants, both mainline and evangelical, non-denominational, Orthodox, any stripe of Christian together, they made up 54% of the country. Last year, that number had dropped to 43%, right? So 11 percentage points and just in the last 2 election cycles between 2008 and 2016. It's a really important milestone, I think, in our nation's life. And one of the reasons why I wrote the book is really to have a healthy conversation about what that means, to really get out of the stage of denial, move towards some kind of acceptance of the new realities in which we're living. To sharpen up this focus, let me just give you a couple of numbers about generational divides. So it's one thing to kind of look back over trends in the past and see where they're going. But if you look at the generational divides, you'll see really a portrait of continuation. So if we use the same metric and we look at the difference between seniors in the country, those 65 of age or older, and younger Americans under the age of 30, you'll see the stark differences just in the snapshot of the generations that are alive today. So again, taking this metric of all white Christians in the country, that's every kind of Christian, white, non-Hispanic Christian. If you look at seniors, 65% of seniors identify as white and Christian. Only 22% of young adults under the age of 30 identify as white and Christians. That's a factor of 3, right? Just over the generations that are alive today. We see these this decline across all white Christian denominational families. So it's not just one group pulling it. So one that's gotten, I think, most of the press is white mainline Protestants, really, whose decline began a little earlier in the 1960s. 19% of seniors are white mainline Protestant, but only 8% of young adults identify as white mainline Protestant. White Catholics, 16% of seniors identify as white Catholic. Only 6% of young adults identify as white and Catholic. And this is one that's maybe a surprise because white evangelicals have had, I think, the most vivid public presence in our shared civic life. But 26% of seniors identify as white evangelical Protestants, but only 8% of young adults identify as white evangelical Protestants. Again, a factor of 3 over this time, all the while where there's basically mostly stability among African American Christians and growth among Latino Christians in the country. So this decline is really about a white non-Hispanic decline across the Christian landscape. The other thing I would point to that really I think has been maybe underestimated in the press is the shift, that's a bellwether measure for cultural shift in the country, is the shift around attitudes on same-sex marriage. Right? This is an issue that particularly the conservative wing of white Christian America has been kind of all in on from the beginning. It's been a defining issue. But again, if we just use the same metric, 2008 to the present, in 2008, only 4 in 10 Americans supported same-sex marriage. Right? Barack Obama himself did not publicly support same-sex marriage in 2008. Our numbers last year showed that number had grown to 58%. And in our more recent polling in 2017, it's jumped again to 63%. So kind of a very quick movement. There's not many public opinion measures that you can see that kind of movement on. And all of this, just to kind of put it all together, all of this coincides, right, with our 2 terms of our first African-American president and the loss of the last Protestant justice on the U.S. Supreme Court with the retirement of John Paul Stevens in 2010. Right? So we have these kind of symbolic changes along with changes on the ground. It is a lot of change in a short amount of time. So what happened? Where did they go? So this was a lot of movement in the landscape. I think about the answer to this using what I might call the 3 Ds. The first D, demographic change. Some of this has to do with immigration, primarily from Latino immigration from Mexico over the last few decades that has begun to shift the American population. The second one that's often ignored that's important is declining birth rates. And that's particularly among white Christians. The birth rate among white Christians has gone down, and particularly among white evangelical Christians, as white evangelical women have started getting college degrees, which has been very closely linked to birth rates in the country. The third one, and this is the big one, and the internal one, those are both external. The internal factor for the Christian world is disaffiliation, right? And again, if you go back to the early 1990s, the number of Americans who claimed no religious affiliation, who said they were atheist, agnostic, or claimed no religious affiliation, was only 6%. As recently as 1990. Our latest numbers from 2016 show that number has almost quadrupled to 23%. Today. So nearly a quarter of Americans claim no religious affiliation whatsoever. And again, if you look at the divide between young people and seniors, you'll see this snapshot even in more focus. Only 12% of seniors claim no religious affiliation, but 36% of young adults under the age of 30 claim no religious affiliation whatsoever. So we're pushing toward nearly 4 in 10 of the youngest generation claiming no religious affiliation whatsoever. The main reasons that we get when we've asked in surveys and focus groups, it really come in a couple of buckets. Clashes over science and evolution have been one, as particularly more conservative churches have staked out kind of positions that are contrary to scientific findings on evolution. Clashes over climate change is another area that is closely related to science. And then the other one is maybe not surprising, but about a third of people who were raised religious and left. And by the way, most of those people in that category leave by the time they're 20, right? So it's an early disaffiliation. About a third of them say that negative teachings about or negative treatment of LGBT people was a very important reason why they left. So this is kind of a big part of the mix. So this is kind of the lay of the land and what the chart would look like here toward the end of white Christian America's life. So how do we understand that then in the context of this last election? I got a lot of snarky emails from people after the election saying, hey, what about your title? Don't you want to put a little asterisk out there at the end of the title? Which seemed, because the last election cycle seemed a bit at odds with this idea that white Christian America was coming to an end. So let me say a few words about that. I think the first thing to remember is, as many of our last elections have been, it's important to remember just how close this election cycle was. It's hard to remember that, I think, because so many things changed as a result of it. But if you look again at the Electoral College vote and the popular vote as well, you see a portrait of basically out of 137 million votes cast, the election basically turned on 77,744 votes in 3 states. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. In Wisconsin, it came down to 10,000 votes different that swung the Electoral College. So very, very close election. The other thing to remember, I think, in the American context is that the ballot box has essentially functioned kind of as a time machine in U.S. politics. And what I mean by that is that we don't see the demographic changes that we have in the general population reflected quite yet at the ballot box, mostly because white Christians turn out at much higher rates than other Americans do, right? So that means that they can kind of remain disproportionately represented at the ballot box, even while their numbers are shrinking in the general population. In fact, if the current trends continue, even though we've now crossed to the general population being less than a majority white and Christian, it will still be 2024 before we have an electorate that is less than majority white and Christian. And just one kind of, I think, very clear example here is white evangelical Protestants who made up 26% of voters, but now only make up 17% of the population, right? So they're overrepresented by nearly 9 percentage points in the electorate. So all that explains something about the electorate and kind of why the ballot box doesn't quite reflect the change. But then there is Donald Trump. right? And to understand the mystery, I think, that is Donald Trump and his support, particularly from white evangelical Protestants in this last election cycle. Many of you may know that he got basically the same percentage support as any other Republican presidential candidate has gotten, about 8 and 10. 81% is the number from the exit polls of white evangelical Protestants who supported Trump. That's about the same as all the other past 4, at least, Republican presidents. But one of the things that I realized in this election cycle is it was remarkable how little policy seemed to matter in this election, right? There were no great policy debates about the big ideas. What we essentially had was a battle about 2 competing visions of who the country should be in light of the cultural changes we're experiencing. And it came to, even if you look at the slogans, right, it was pretty clear. Donald Trump's slogan of "Make America Great Again." Right, the most important word is that last one, again, right? What does it mean? Like it was before. Before what? Right? Before civil rights, before the LGBT rights movement, before women's rights. There's a number of things that's before. It harkens back to this kind of lost era in the country. And then you had Hillary Clinton's logo with this very slick and modern looking H with this arrow pointing ahead, right? So you have Donald Trump explicitly pointing backward, Hillary literally pointing forward with the stronger together, embracing of pluralism kind of motif in her campaign. I really think that was really what the debate turned out to be about. But I think to really understand what happened with Trump, and particularly his support from white evangelicals, is that I think what we saw in the election was this transformation of self-described values voters into being what I call nostalgia voters in this last election, who were animated more by anxiety about a lost past than they were by a set of enduring principles. So since I'm a stats guy, I will actually give you some numbers. I think the sort of point to this. One of the most interesting questions we asked at PRRI this last election cycle wasn't a policy question, but it was a question about the 1950s. And we asked Americans, do you think things have basically changed for the better or changed for the worst since the 1950s? It turns out the country is evenly divided on this question, and there is almost perfect partisan polarization on this question. 2/3 of Democrats say things have changed for the better since the 1950s. 2/3 of Republicans say things have changed for the worse since the 1950s. And by the way, all white Christian groups in the country, white mainline Protestants, white Catholics, and white evangelical Protestants, all say things have changed for the worst since the 1950s. About 6 in 10 white Catholics and white mainline Protestants say that, but here's the kicker, 75% of white evangelicals say that. So 3/4 of white evangelicals. There's no group who is more convinced that things have changed for the worse since the 1950s, since white evangelicals. So that's, I think, the power of nostalgia on the front end. But then there was this, though. You can also see the disintegration of a commitment to a set of unchanging values and a question that we asked about the importance of a political candidate's character. In 2011 and again in 2016, PRI asked whether a candidate who commits an immoral act in his or her private life can nonetheless behave ethically and fulfill their duties in their public life. In 2011, only 30% of white evangelical Protestants agreed that this was possible. By 2016, this number had shifted to an astonishing 72%. So with Trump at the top of the ticket, white evangelical Protestants basically went from the least likely to the most likely group to say that a candidate's moral character had little to do with their job performance. So my conclusion about that, which I write in the afterword of the book, is this, that, what immediately came to my mind is Esau, right? So, like Esau, who traded his inheritance for a pot of stew, white evangelicals, I think, in this last election, have traded their distinctive values for fleeting political power. So no matter how many Christian conservative leaders are installed in positions of power over the next 4 years, I think there's little chance we're going to look back ultimately at this election and celebrate it as the revival of white Christian America. Rather, I think this election is going to be one that's remembered as the one in which white evangelicals traded away their integrity in a gambit to resurrect their past. So I'll close with this. As alluring as turning the clock back may be to white Christian America's loyalists, Efforts to resurrect the dead are futile at best, and at worst, disrespectful to its memory. Like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, resurrection by human power rather than divine spirit always produces a monstrosity. If resurrection is not possible, both white evangelicals and white mainline Protestants, each representing sizable constituency in the country still, will need to choose between a sectarian retreat and a new kind of engagement. It seems highly unlikely that the descendants of white Christian America, having seen themselves at the center of American power for so long, will find a self-imposed marginal retreat very comfortable. If this option proves unsatisfying, the only other course, as I see it, is a different kind of social arrangement in which white evangelical and white mainline Protestants find their seats at the table alongside Catholics, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and the religiously unaffiliated. And this time, they will be guests rather than hosts.
Thank you very much, Robbie. Now, I'm sure that immediately after this, these people will rush to the bookstore to read your book altogether and get the whole picture of this. But I want to ask you a few quick political questions, not partisan questions, but the questions I would ask as a journalist. There are white evangelicals and there are white evangelicals, and the media tend to lump all evangelicals together. What distinction do you make?
Well, it's worth noting, I mean, the number 81% got a lot of attention, right? That's the support for Trump. And it's, as I said, it's 8 and 10 is about what you get. So it's remarkable, too, that if you take candidates as different as George W. Bush, John McCain, Mitt Romney, and Donald Trump, they all got about 8 and 10 support from white evangelical Protestants. But it's worth saying that that leaves about 20% of evangelicals voting Democrat, right? And there's not a lot of attention to that, but that's there. So it's lopsided, but there is still this pretty solid constituency of about 20% of white evangelical Protestants that actually vote for Democratic candidates.
And they are the religious group that dominates the Republican agenda, correct?
White evangelicals.
White
yes.
evangelicals,
yeah, that's
right.
Yeah.
On Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network last September, and I think you mentioned this in your book, I remember reading about it at the time, Donald Trump said, and I'm quoting, "If we don't win this election," he's saying to Pat Robertson, who is the godfather of the Christian right over the last 30 to 40 years, along with the late Jerry Falwell, he said, "Pat, if we don't win this election, you'll never see another Republican, and you'll have a whole different church structure." How did you take that? What was the dog whistle he was blowing?
I think later on he actually ended up saying, "This is your last chance, folks."
Yeah, he said, "I think this will be the last election that the Republicans have a chance of winning because you're going to have people flowing across the border, you're going to have illegal immigrants coming in, and they're going to be legalized, and they're going to be able to vote, and once that all happens, you can forget it."
You can forget it, yeah. No, I think that this, one of the things that Trump, I think, was very good at keying in on is the great feelings of anxiety and fear about cultural change in the country that many white Christians were feeling, particularly white evangelicals who are at the heart of the Republican Party, and making a direct play to those fears. So it's not only the country's going to change, your churches are going to change. It's this great worry that America will no longer be America. Is the way you hear this talked about a lot. Michelle Bachmann was on the week after him, basically on the same talking points, just saying, this is it. If we don't win this election, the country's going to change to the point where we will never be able to get it back.
I used to think that if you only watch Fox News, you're blind in your left eye. If you only watch MSNBC, you're blind in your right eye. And if you watch Pat Robertson, you're blind in both eyes. But I was wrong. I'm wrong. I'm wrong. Judith has been urging us to watch Fox News, and I've been thinking I should go back to watching Christian broadcasting because you do learn what these folks are saying to each other, and it is speaking to the internal tribe.
Yeah, that's right. I think that the word tribe is right. I've been thinking a lot more about, where to think about this next. And actually, Andrew Sullivan, for those of you here this morning, mentioned this word tribe, right? This kind of worry about a kind of tribal nature of our politics. And I do think that's one of the biggest worries I have. If you look at the way the parties have sorted themselves out, essentially since the civil rights movement in Reagan, they have sorted themselves kind of into these racial and religious tribes that have been turbocharged, I think, in the last election. So right now, if you look at the two parties, like the Democratic Party today is about 3 in 10 Democrats are white and Christian, but about 3/4 of Republicans are white and Christian, right? So there's this kind of partisan sort, and it's happening along racial and religious lines. And as human beings, I mean, those are pretty visceral divides. If you get partisanship layered with race and religion, it's a pretty difficult rope to untie.
I was reminded of the next question because Judith and I were recently at the LBJ Library to do a symposium with the Lyndon Johnson Library, the 2 Bush libraries that are in Texas, and the Clinton Library in Arkansas. They're collaborating on a program of presidential scholars leadership fellows, and they bring them to each library to look at how presidents made policy. And I was reminded in my presentation that after LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 on July 2nd, 1964, that evening he said to me, I think we just handed the South to the Republican Party for my lifetime and yours, and he was right. You will remember that Jimmy Carter was elected in 1976 with a majority of white evangelical voters. But 4 years later, white evangelical reporters moved over to Ronald Reagan, and they've been voting for Republican candidates ever since, heavily focused, but not exclusively focused, in the South, until Trump overwhelmed all of the other Republican candidates since then. What do you think? You were just a kid then, but you're a scholar and a historian with your numbers. Was there a trigger? Jimmy Carter was a Baptist Sunday school teacher married to one wife in rural Georgia. He's been teaching the Sunday school all of his life. Ronald Reagan was twice divorced. I know twice divorced, never went to church. And yet we were present at the first meeting of the moral majority in 1980 in Dallas, where Reagan spoke, and Jerry Falwell and most of the audience of Southern Baptists rose up as huzzahs, rose up in cheers for them. What triggered in the Carter administration, or that era, the switch?
Yeah, so there's a great book called The Rise of the Republican South that 2 political scientists, who are actually twin brothers, Merle and Earl Black, wrote. And in the book is probably the best description. They call it the Great White Switch, right, that happened really with Reagan. And there was, before Reagan, there was a lot of cross-voting where Southern Democrats were still voting for Democratic candidates at the local level, but they were maybe voting for Republican presidential candidates. But with Reagan, they actually switched parties. So when we really see the switch. So I have a whole chapter on race in the book, and I just think this is a piece where we really haven't faced squarely the role that the civil rights movement and reactions to it gave us the political parties that we have today. And I think just wrestling with that very seriously. So, I don't know that it was so much Carter. I mean, I think certainly they were expecting Carter to carry some water that he didn't carry in that election, and particularly on separation of church and state issues. Carter wasn't, willing to conflate those in the way that I think many on the conservative wing of the evangelical world were hoping he would.
LBJ thought there were 2 developments long before this that began to shape what would ultimately emerge as the Republican domination of the Christian right. One was the school prayer decision by the Supreme Court, I think it was 1963, and the other before that was the Brown versus Board of Education ordering the desegregation of schools, after which every Southern senator except 3, and one of them was Johnson, voted for the Southern mandate, which was going to fight the Supreme Court decision. He thought those 2 set the ground up, and that when Carter did not endorse those moves, he lost. He didn't think that last one. He was dead by then, by the time Carter came along. But he thought in time Republicans would dominate the South because in no small part, those two decisions. You think that's
No,
critical?
that seems right to me. I mean, it really, that's one of the things I think that became clearest to me is just how big and unresolved the whole issue of race is for our politics and our public culture. I mean, we've asked about, for example, just say, look, this weekend in Charlottesville, Virginia, there were 50 Klansmen arrested, or there were actually they weren't arrested, there was a big fight that the police had to break up with tear gas over 50 Klansmen from North Carolina showing up and demonstrating over the removal of the statue of Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville, right? New Orleans has been in turmoil, had to remove the statues in the middle of the night to avoid big clashes. So I think we're reckoning with many of these things that have been just kind of down and to the side. And the whole issue, for example, of the police shooting of unarmed black men in the country. What's striking about the numbers, when you ask people about that, we've asked people whether you think these kind of spate of shootings are part of a broader pattern of how police treat African Americans, or are they simply isolated incidents. Whites are much more likely, like twice as likely as African Americans, to say they're isolated incidents. But here's the kicker. If you take your average white person and you add religion, they move further away from African American opinions on this question. It's actually white unaffiliated Americans who are more likely to see this kind of systemic pattern in the country than white Christians are.
These figures leaped out from your book. Large majorities of Democrats believe minority groups, African Americans, immigrants, Muslim, gay, and transgender people, face a lot of discrimination. Only one in five Democrats say that majority groups such as Christians or whites face a lot of discrimination. Republicans, on the other hand, you write, believe Christians and whites face roughly as much discrimination as immigrants, Muslims, gay, and transgender people. Only 27% of Republicans say blacks experience a lot of discrimination, while 47% of Republicans say whites do, and 48% say the same of Christians. And over and again, they refer to Fox's War on Christmas as evidence that white Christians are facing the same kind of discrimination that black African Americans do.
Yeah, I mean, the perception differences in the country are just striking. So if you combine that with the sense of Associated Press and NORC, the National Opinion Research Center at University of Chicago, did a great poll a couple of months back that asked about what holds Americans together, like what is it? Basically, 2/3 of Democrats say it's the mixing, what's most important is the mixing of different cultures and people from around the world. That's what makes Americans unique. But among Republicans, the answer, about 2/3 of Republicans said, on the contrary, that it's actually a kind of core white Christian culture, or not white Christian culture, it's a core Christian culture in that survey question that holds America together. So there's this clear sense on the one hand of a loss. And the one thing the two parties do agree on, by the way, is that we're losing a sense of a shared American culture. Like so 3/4 of both Republicans and Democrats think we're losing this shared sense of American culture. But what we should embrace is a very different partisan experience. And when partisans look out today, they do see very different views of who's experiencing discrimination. And increasingly, we're finding that Republicans and white Christians also see themselves as persecuted as anyone else in the country.
Don't you see? I took from your book that you see losing a particular historic American identity. You know, G.K. Chesterton, I think you quote, came to this country and wrote about the soul of America is the church. America has the soul of a church. And you take that another step to say he didn't actually mean in a religious sense.
Right.
He meant in the issue of this identity, right?
Yeah, that's a tricky quote. It often gets pulled out of context. So what G.K. Chesterton is a British kind of prolific writer, came over, as did de Tocqueville, the late 19th century, early 20th century, because they were curious about how we were making this work, right, in the American context. We weren't relying on, for example, German ancestry to qualify you as German, or French ancestry to qualify you as truly French. But he called it, America was making a home out of vagabonds, you know, as the way Chesterton talked about it. So they were curious about how this was working. When he said America has the soul of a church, what he meant that to become a member of a church, what you do is you assent to a creed. right? He didn't really mean that it's Christianity, but he meant the basis of American identity was assent to a creed, and the creed that he was talking about was actually the Constitution, right? It was the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is the creed that Americans assent to, and so in that way, it's a belief system that makes one American, not a kind of ethnic or cultural ancestry, and he thought that was remarkable, really, in its day. And what I think is happening is that we have kind of cheated, right? So we've had these principles of pluralism and religious liberty, but we have all along, when we put those in place, and all really up until the last decade, we've been able to cheat because we've been able to kind of affirm those principles while we kind of knew we had a white Protestant majority anyway, right? So it's one thing if you've got a kind of secure majority to be all generous and open up the doors and say, yeah, come on in. But I think we're being thrown back to the fundamental question of whether we really believe those principles or not, and whether that's really the central thing that makes Americans American.
Can you break your analysis down last year between men, white evangelicals who voted for Trump, and women, white women evangelicals who voted for Trump?
Yeah, what happened for us is we saw those differences bigger in the primary, and they basically got very, very close and hard to distinguish in the general election. And I think it's really because what we did see wider separation in the primary season when there were other candidates out there, but still Trump swept the field. I mean, I was waiting, or I guess the first clue I had was when Trump won the South Carolina Republican primary, right? Because there were a bunch of candidates still in the race at that time. It was right after Iowa. Cruz had won Iowa. But the thing about South Carolina, it's the first primary in kind of evangelical territory. 75% of people who vote in the South Carolina primary are white evangelical Protestants. So it's a very homogeneous primary, and Trump handily won it. That was my first clue that something was up, and that the firewall that Cruz was expecting to hold, especially in the Super Tuesday southern states. I mean, Trump sort of won from Mississippi to Michigan, on Super Tuesday.
South Carolina is a peculiar and particular and influential bellwether. If you remember when John McCain ran against George W. Bush, a born-again Christian, in South Carolina, McCain was doing well in the rest of the country, but in South Carolina, they stopped him cold and stomped him with the story that circulated that he was the father of a black child in South Carolina. And George W. Bush just pummeled McCain, and it was over for McCain. And again, that strain of racism has played a great deal in that bellwether state. I have one more question, and then we're going to take, for the last half hour, we're going to take questions from you directly. You mentioned the character issue, that so many Baptists in particular put aside their concerns about Trump's misogynism and groping of women and all of that. Ted Cruz is a longtime Southern Baptist. Marco Rubio is a Catholic who can speak genuinely and familiarly about Jesus as his personal relationship. How do you explain that here were two sworn religious men whom Donald Trump, with obviously no history, public history of religious commitment and devotion, beat both of them in the Republican primary?
There was also Rick Santorum, who was still in the race, who's also Catholic, but clearly can speak to that audience. No, it's remarkable. It really, I mean, that was, again, when South Carolina he fell for Trump, that was my first clue that something different was going on. I actually wrote a piece in the Atlantic where I first used the nostalgia voter phrase in February after the South Carolina primary, because it did seem to me that he had just changed the playbook. So, Cruz was arguing out of the old kind of Christian right playbook and, giving his testimony and touting his Southern Baptist credentials, while Trump was making all kinds of mistakes. I mean, in Iowa, he put money in the offering plate, money in the communion plate in Iowa, thinking it was the offering plate. He quoted 2 Corinthians rather than 2 Corinthians, like kind of just demonstrating he didn't really know the vernacular. I mean, so he was making all kinds of mistakes. But what I really do think what became more important in this was Trump. When Trump spoke to a crowd in Iowa, and he basically just said, like, this is a quote. He said, if you elect me, I'm going to restore power to the Christian churches. Right, that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to sort of bring back the manufacturing jobs to the Midwest. I'm going to restore power to the Christian churches. And it was that overt appeal, I think, to just restoring a primary place. And he didn't mean African American churches when he said that. I mean, he meant kind of white, mostly Protestant churches in the country.
I take from your analysis that you think, I'm not saying you hope, but you seem to think that the changing demographics will in fact shift the balance of power between Republicans and Democrats. But the Republicans have been brilliantly playing a long game by which they figure they can govern indefinitely with a minority party because of their control in the 30 some odd states over the state representation. They can control the electoral college. So they may be prepared to govern 30 or 40 more years just being a minority party. Do you think that's a feasible possibility?
It's difficult. When you look at the reliance of both political parties on white Christian voters, what you basically see is that Republicans over time have relied on each coalition, Romney, Bush, McCain, and Trump, have all relied on a coalition that was about 8 and 10 white and Christian, while Democrats have been reducing their reliance on white Christian voters over time as the proportion has been dropping in the population. But like I said, the challenge is that even at the national level, the ballot box is about 10 years behind the population changes in the country.
What do you mean?
So that, like I said, so we've already seen, right, our slippage from a majority white Christian country to a non-majority white Christian country in the population. But it won't be till 2024 that happens at the ballot box because of the higher turnout rates of white Christians. So they've got a while to play just on that. But the other tools that we'll see, I think, reach for example, are voter ID laws, which we know disproportionately affect African American and Latino voters by making it more difficult, particularly for them. All the studies show that it makes minority voting more difficult. So that's one way to delay, I think, the inevitable, even while the population changes are happening. But the other thing you mentioned is locking down just enough states, right, and in key states to lock it down, even if they lose the Electoral College and the presidency. Hanging on to the House, the Senate may go back and forth. There'll be enough, and at the state level, there may be enough happening that will sort of hang on to and preserve. I think what we may be hearing a lot more of is some language we thought we may not have heard for a while, and that is like our way of life. Preserving our way of life, which we heard, I think, a lot after Brown v. Board of Education, during Reconstruction. We may be hearing that language a lot more. Like I said, we are seeing an uptick in hate crimes, kind of a more visible Klan here and there. Those things, I think, are a result of this great anxiety over this change. And at the end of the day, I think it really is about and I think we may see the political parties organizing themselves less around liberal to conservative axis and more around one party that's kind of embracing cultural pluralism, one party that's embracing a kind of white Christian monism, and that these are two incompatible, at the end of the day, visions of the country going forward.
So as our questioners line up over here, quickly answer this question. What did the Republican campaigners, strategists know last year that the Democrats didn't know?
Yeah.
About religion.
I think they may have sensed. I'm not a great subscriber of that there was great brilliant strategists. Again, this election was so close. I mean, it really could have gone either way at the end of the day, and it just came down to the wire. Again, 78,000 votes is not that many votes. It's 0.05% of all the votes that were cast in the election is what this came down to. So what I would say is that what Trump and his kind of leadership team, I think, sensed that Democrats did not was the great deal of fear and anxiety over cultural change that's here in the country. And particularly, I think Democrats and liberals in general have not really felt or even taken seriously the weight that the Obergefell Supreme Court decision legalizing same-sex marriage in all 50 states had among conservative white Christian America. It was a nuclear event among conservative white Christians in the country. And I think that, along with cultural change, really did put us in a bit of a tinderbox situation.
Thank you. We're going to start at the right and go to the left. But if any of you, PBS has not yet found a successor to the weekly show that Judith and I used to do. So if you're auditioning, I want to urge you, keep your questions very short. All right, we'll start over here.
You said you would start with the right. I beg to differ on that. But I hear what you're saying. The current president of the White House, in a speech a few days ago, said a few things that were then spoken of in a tweet by Mrs. Palin, about 14 words. You may be familiar with the dog whistle associated with that. More chilling, perhaps, was his use of the phrase, will to survive, which to me echoes a Nietzschean will to power, which I find very chilling given the history of Nietzsche and the Third Reich. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, I think it goes to this question of anxiety and underestimating, I think, the real anxiety. And, and one of the reasons why I named the book as starkly as I did, right, the end of white Christian America, is because I really did want to make the point to both the left and the right that this is something real happening in the country. I mean, and so, in the book, I imagine myself giving a eulogy, and many of you may be pastors in here. One of the worst things you can be called on to do is to give a eulogy in a very complicated family situation, right? Where there are some people who are genuinely weeping, some people who are like, good riddance, to the deceased. And I think that's where we are as a country in many ways, right? We've got a lot of people who are like, man, white Christian America, goodbye, about time. My Twitter feed looks like that sometimes, and then my Facebook page looks like the other side, where it's, that democracy itself is going to die, right, if white Christian America dies. It's that kind of sense that the country will be lost. I mean, there really is this visceral reaction that I think we've got to take seriously. And, the challenge is, how do we tell a story about who it is to be American that is going to sort of lean into the realities on the ground, and at the same time, I think, pay homage to the great contributions that white Christians made to the country. And the worry I have about the parties right now is that the Republican Party is going to double down on a kind of white Christian nationalism, but that the Democratic Party is going to double down on a multiculturalism that doesn't have room for white Christians in the party. And who's going to be left out are white Christians who are kind of wary of that nationalism stuff, but they're weary of getting discounted in the politics in kind of multicultural politics as well. And I think that's not a healthy thing for the country.
Yes, sir.
Yep.
I have an article at home by a Catholic seminary professor, I think from Boston, who basically called out Catholic bishops and the Catholic population as electing Donald Trump and not speaking out against his character flaws for the bishops. And his thesis primarily was, it's not time for reconciliation, which a lot of people were bishops and others were talking about, let's reconcile. He said, it's time to recognize what happened and the divide in this country and try to heal the divisions. Are there any voices in the white Christian evangelical academia or whatever who are making similar comments?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I write at the end of the book, I also write about Russell Moore, who is a Southern Baptist, and that's the largest evangelical denomination in the country that itself has been feeling its own kind of decline. It's now posted 10 straight years of membership declines, and that's the largest evangelical denomination in the country. But Russell Moore, I think, has been very sensitive on issues of race. He was very outspoken about what it meant to vote your values, and his arguments before the election were that it could be anybody but Trump, was basically his position, to be consistent with the values that they had laid out. He's been under a lot of, as you might imagine, now that Trump has won, he's been under a lot of pressure. He's somebody to watch, I think, as kind of a bellwether, because he is the head of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission at the Southern Baptist Convention, which is basically the chief lobbying arm for the SBC. So I think watching where he goes and where he's able to go, I think, is a good measure of kind of where the denomination will go.
Yes, sir.
Historically, presidential candidates have always tried to pander to the religious community to greater or less effect. What about the rise of Bernie Sanders? He seems to be the first presidential candidate who was taken seriously, who never used religious language, and gained tremendous popularity. Is that a trend? And can you give us any prognostications in terms of the power of the religious community and the rise of non-religious presidential candidates?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So it's interesting that what we're seeing in the country is that so we certainly have never seen exactly an atheist candidate. There's actually very few atheists in Congress, but the public is starting to make a distinction between people who just aren't religious and atheists, which is interesting. So when we've asked about whether you would vote for a political candidate who has various all things being equal, who was a woman, who was a Catholic, who was an evangelical, who was an atheist, who is unaffiliated or doesn't attend religious services, there's now much less stigma just for someone who doesn't attend. There's basically two groups that we see over and over in our surveys where there's still a great amount of stigma for political candidates. One of them is being an atheist, an outright sort of atheist saying, I don't believe in God, making a declarative statement like that. The other one is being Muslim. So those are the two categories that still carry some stigma in the public for folks. But Sanders is an interesting example. I guess the other thing I would say is that it tends to matter less on the Democratic side of politics than it does on the Republican side of politics. There's less of an expectation that people are going to trot out their personal faith testimony or their personal religious bona fides. You'll also notice Hillary Clinton didn't talk about it that much in this election cycle. In fact, she talked about it much more when she was running against Obama than she did in this last election cycle. And I think that's because Obama was pretty fluent in that language, and she needed to kind of meet him there. It's not that she couldn't tell that story. I've heard her tell it, a bunch of times. She's got a great Methodist, resume if she wanted to kind of tell that. But it's not one she led with. So I think we'll see it less on the Democratic side. It doesn't seem like it's something that you'd spend a great deal worrying is going to torpedo your candidacy, at least on the Democratic side.
Yes.
Question for you, Bill. So last year we heard the Reverend Dr. Samuel Barber give an impassioned and hopeful talk about the need for another Reconstruction. Where do you see those kinds of voices rising up and inspiring us?
It's hard to pick them out in advance. There are people like Reverend Barber who are forging a new dynamic, I think, in our politics. And Sister Simone Campbell, the nurse on the bus, the nun on the bus who's been leading that campaign, she's the champion of helping the poor today. She's got I think, emerging powerful role to play. But it's at this very moment, there are young people around the country getting arrested. There are young people leading protests. There are young people organizing in their neighborhoods. 1, 2, 3 more are going to emerge. Who knew, the abolition movement at one time and the suffragette movement at one time were tiny cells of concerned people. It's just not very far from here. Susan B. Anthony paid a $200 fine because she voted. That was a crime for a woman to vote. This is slow democracy. It's like slow bicycling. It's slow democracy, and it's probably too slow, I think, to offset the damage likely to be done to the institutions of this country in the next 4 to 8 years. But I can't identify where the next the next John Kennedy or the next Franklin Roosevelt or the next Eleanor Roosevelt are going to rise. I just have faith, this being Test Your Faith Week, I have faith that they're out there.
Thank you.
To the extent that what's being taught in the churches should be a total rejection of racism, to what extent will there be an identification, perhaps by the Democrats or maybe somebody even in the Republican Party, that the evangelical right that is rising up is overtly racist, and how much of that comes down to the economic forces at play?
Yeah. So the question is about kind of racism. I do think that churches are starting to face it, right? That churches are, universities are, like Georgetown University in D.C. for the first time is acknowledging the role that the sale of slaves early in its history made when they were basically facing bankruptcy. They saved themselves by selling slaves to a slaveholder in Louisiana and now track down the descendants of those slaves to try to make some kind of reparations. A lot of churches that date back to pre-Civil War, I think, are trying to sort out what do we do with the fact that our church building was built with slave labor. Like, how do we sort that out in the country? But to the present, I would say this: it's certainly more acute in the white evangelical Protestant community, but because we're here, and I'm guessing there's more mainliners here. One of the striking things that I've seen in the data is that even though, like, the Methodists and the Episcopalians and the United Church of Christ and the Presbyterians were on the kind of front lines of the civil rights movement. We do not see what you would expect to see with that legacy in the pews today in public opinion surveys among white mainline Protestants in the country. In fact, just on that one point I was telling you about whether shootings of African American men by police are part of a broader pattern are an isolated incident. White mainline Protestants look like all whites together. They're not more likely to say they're. You would think, right, that mainline Protestants have teachings about systemic injustice, structures of power, like being able to see like more than just individual racism. But in our public opinion surveys, we don't actually see that they look that different than whites overall. So I would say there's work to be done both in the evangelical world, and it's more acute there and maybe overt, but also in the mainline Protestant world, the slope is not as downhill as you might think.
Yes.
This is a question for both of you. It's clear that religion is becoming less relevant to the lives of many Americans. What should the religious community leaders be doing to make religions more relevant so that people want to embrace it, whether they believe in evolution or they believe in the Bible or whatever? What should our religious leaders be doing? Are they active enough? Are they doing anything?
Oh, yeah, I'll give that to you, Bill.
I missed the first part of the question.
Religion is becoming less relevant in our society. The question is why, and what can religious leaders do to make it more relevant so that young people can relate to it?
I'm going to address that on Friday afternoon, I hope. They have to stop calling per se for dialogue, and they have to start saying fight again. Fight for the progressive values you believe in. Fight for the right. We're not trying to be nice. We're not trying to be accepted. But we're going to fight. As Andrew Sullivan said, I was surprised to hear, not surprised, I was pleased to hear him say Christianity should stand against power. We have to recapture that. The Jewish prophets should be our guide today, and the teachings of Jesus should be our guide. Not the Democratic agenda, not the Republican agenda, but what we really believe this country should stand for. We as Christians, as secularists, whoever we are, we have to fight. Let me tell you, I've followed the Republican strategy since 1970. It's brilliant, diabolical, and successful. And they have fought, manipulated, organized, paid for this entire movement that now has control of the House and the Senate, the Supreme Court, and the White House. They fought. And our friends, many of them were friends on the right in the churches, they got out on election day and organized. They really put their values behind their muscle, or their muscle behind their values. And that's what has to happen, or when we gather here again 10 years from now, we'll be half the audience. I think that's what has to happen.
I'm going to throw in one comment on there. I want to make sure I don't take up too much time. But as someone who came out of the evangelical world in the South, where churches generally, at least when I was growing up, they're kind of paying their salaries as they go, and they're collecting offerings, and they set the budget every year. What was foreign to me is a church with millions and millions of dollars of an endowment sitting on the sidelines of things. And I think one of the challenges for the mainline churches that have tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in real estate and endowments to take a hard look and think carefully about, like, what do we do with that? If you're looking for a rainy day, it's raining.
Yeah.
So
That's exactly right. We have 5 more minutes. Going to try to get everybody in.
Good afternoon. I'm a white Muslim born and raised in New Jersey, and I was wondering, by way of all the research that you've been doing the last few years, especially with the book, should I anticipate more attacks and probably killings against my Muslim brothers and sisters, just like the thing in Portland? Or are these just random incidences of people with mental disabilities?
Yeah, no, it's an important question. And, what we basically, the long-term trends that we've seen are, basically when 9/11 happened, not many people had thought much about Islam or Muslims. Americans knew not much. And there was this kind of grace period, I would call it. And what we've seen is basically an uptick in more negative views toward Muslims lately. But there is this kind of ambiguous thing happening where it was a couple of years ago since we asked this question, but when we asked it about whether, on the one hand, is Islam compatible with democratic values, right? About 6 in 10 Americans say no to that question, a kind of a more negative view. But when we ask about whether Muslims are an important part of the American religious community, about 6 in 10 also say yes to that question. So I think there is this kind of push and pull thing happening. The other thing to say is that almost no Americans know someone Muslim, right? So almost everything.
Hello.
So yeah. So yeah, it's less than 1 in 10 Americans who say they have any kind of regular interaction with anyone Muslim. So almost everything is very literally mediated, right, through the media, through what media people are watching, and I think that's part of the problem here in the country is that it's usually opinions based on very little direct experience.
Yes.
It sounds like you have posited that the Democrats are putting all in to say that we're going to become a more multicultural society, and they're going to be banking on that, and therefore by 2024 things may shift. I'm wondering if that's not too simplistic a thinking, because some of the multicultural things that are coming in have views on women that may be more in line with some of the religious white right that we've had in the past. So I'm wondering how you've taken that into account.
Yeah, well, I so want to be careful. I'm certainly not a subscriber to the demographics as destiny full-on argument here. I don't want to be heard saying it that strongly, because there's all kinds of intervening things that could happen, right? That could change the game here. I think you're right. I mean, one of the interesting things that is maybe related to this is that we've seen this divergence on these two issues that used to be always mentioned in one breath. Like in 2004, which is where the kind of values voters thing got really branded in 2004, you could not hear the word same-sex marriage without hearing the word abortion, right? There's abortion and same-sex marriage, they were always together. And what we've seen since then is that opinions on same-sex marriage have really gone their own way, while opinions on abortion have actually stayed quite stable over time. So there has not been a corresponding movement there. We're also seeing like fights over contraception, right, around religious liberty. So I mean, these debates are still with us, and they're not, I think, moving in the way that debates around the other debates around sexuality are. So I think you're right to kind of name that as a fault line and something to kind of keep an eye on going forward. Yeah.
I think we have to take this final question, but if the 5 of you who are left will give me your name or to Robert, we'll make sure that on Friday you get the first 5 questions at the session. He is moderating with me and others. So I'm sorry about that, but when the director says cut in the studio, you will be cut whether or not you're in mid-sentence or not. So I'm sorry about that, but yours is the last question.
So you presented some compelling statistics on the decline of white Christians in this country. You also artfully juxtaposed Trump's campaign that was looking backward with Hillary's campaign that purported to look forward. And so what I'd really like you to talk about is if the people who are saying that they are Christians maybe aren't even, subscribing to the what would Jesus do test, predominantly when it comes to what they're doing at the ballot, with their ballot, then it sounds like they're operating from a different ideology. And so I'm really curious about your take on using Christianity as maybe a proxy for another ideology or belief system that's really motivating what people are doing. Because if they're not really believing, but then they're using that as a cloak, because religion is, you can't touch it, right? So it feels disingenuous when people say that they are Christians, but then they're not subscribing to the what would Jesus do test. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, I'm going to go back to this word tribal, right, that I mentioned earlier. And here's the thing. I can test it out on most of you really quickly. So if you meet somebody, let's say you meet somebody and you're walking down the sidewalk, and the first thing they say to you is, oh, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat. Most of us today probably think we already know 25 things about that person, right, based on that one piece of information. There was a great poll by some Stanford political scientists in 1960 that asked Americans how worried they would be if their son or daughter married somebody of the opposite political party. In 1960, only 5% of Republicans and 6% of Democrats said they'd be very worried about someone. That question got asked again by Huffington Post and YouGov in 2010. This is the last time it's actually been asked. And the numbers had jumped to 33% of Democrats and nearly half of Republicans today saying they'd be very worried if their son or their daughter married someone of the opposite political party. All that to say is that one of the things I think we all have to check ourselves on is how much is kind of partisanship driving the way we're interpreting the Bible, the way that we're thinking about religiosity and our own faith. Because, for example, like if you take African American Protestant Christians and white evangelical Protestants, I used to do this when I was teaching Religion 101, and you put like beliefs and practices in two columns, you will not see hardly any differences. Virgin birth, belief in a literal heaven and hell, literal interpretation of Scripture, you put it all up there. But then those two communities take those very same beliefs, sing a lot of the same hymns, and go in almost opposite partisan directions, right? African Americans voting more than 9 in 10 for Democrats, white evangelical voting for more than 8 in 10 for Republican candidates. What's the explanation for that? It's partisanship, right? And I think one of the things I'm most worried about is that partisanship is actually the lens through which we validate almost every other thing we have, and it becomes a kind of tribal identity, and there's a kind of disloyalty to the tribe, right, if you are kind of going a different direction than the party itself. I think it's a real danger to the country today.